Hello friends, it is I, Empyrean Serpent, and this is a continuation of my top 100 metal albums of 2019. I will link the previous video containing albums 100 to 61 in the description, but without further ado, let's get into this. At number 60 is Reaped Upon Reflection by Mirthless, and this one is more along the lines of progressive deathcore, interestingly enough, and it is surprisingly well done for the genre. The riffs and leads on this thing are amazing, lots of them being very in line with what you'd expect from extreme progressive metal, yet bridging some of the intensity from the deathcore side of things without becoming too repetitive or standard, which is great. There are a ton of very catchy melodies in the leads on this thing, as well as some more interesting moments overall, which you'll understand a bit more if you check out the album. In any case, this is definitely one of the coolest releases in both deathcore and prog metal from this year. For 59, we have Kósmos by Elessär, another Nightwish-esque symphonic power metal release, though this one has some more progressive tendencies to it than you would normally expect. On top of that, there's a bit of folk influence on this thing as well, so overall the release is pretty varied. And as you would expect, the symphonic portions are great, the vocals are beautiful, and the melodies are pretty fantastic. Some very catchy songwriting throughout, just a very cool and good release overall. At number 58, we get a slightly more interesting release with Blind Equations Born to Die, which is a weird mix of stuff including cybergrind, chiptune sections, some other various metal influences blended in, all with this MIDI-esque sound on a ton of the instrumentation. And to top it off, there's Touhou melodies. This EP is quite wild and very intense at that, with a ton of chaotic riffing and speed, along with some surprisingly great use of melody throughout. Really short, but really fun listen. At 57, we have Takamachi Walk with Wither, which is primarily a melodic metalcore project, though with a lot of EDM implementation, as well as some other mixed influence throughout. The thing that makes this particular release especially fun is that firstly, all the compositions are Touhou based, so that means tons of sick Touhou melodies, and on top of that, there are a ton of artists on this project, so the diversity in composition is very present, and considering that all of the songwriting on here is great, it is certainly quite welcome. Tons of quality riffs, lovely melodies, and excellent performances throughout. For number 56, we get Mooncult by Silver Bullet, which is some pretty classic power metal, and done very well at that. This thing has quite a bit of what you'd want out of your average power metal record. You've got some great catchy vocals with tons of lovely backing vocals to emphasize the strength, lots of high quality, super catchy riffs, great melodies, good and compositionally varied songwriting, some good uplifting feels and emotion, and some solid usage of symphonics on occasion. It all blends together very nicely, and this is just quite a good time overall, especially if you're a fan of power metal. At number 55 on the list, we have Alcest with Spiritual Instinct, Alcest being quite the popular post-metal band at that, and this release is really a great example of some top-tier post-metal. The primary focus on this thing is definitely the atmosphere, and the atmosphere that is invoked on this release is absolutely wonderful. It is extremely present and extremely emotive at that, and all the riffs and floaty vocals help to facilitate it beautifully. All the melodies on here tend to be beautiful and generally really memorable and catchy, and everything feels like it blends together very well. Some decent variety on here too, juxtaposing moments of intensity and serenity quite well. Overall, a stellar listen. Number 54 brings us a somewhat similar but also relatively different release with A Dawn to Fear by Cult of Luna. This thing is a blend of sludge and post-metal, and thanks to that, the atmosphere on this release is just as present as the last, if not more so. But Cult of Luna brings a much darker and consuming presence to their atmosphere, their riffs and overall sound being a lot heavier and more intense, with the emotional impact and feel from the album being a lot more negative, I would say. And at that, it works extremely well, with the dark, brooding emotions present in the atmosphere practically washing over you as you listen. Quite the spooky time, I would say, and a very well-written album in any instance. At number 53, we have Dream Void with Divinization, another technical death metal EP and a fairly intense one at that, blending in some deathcore elements and overall writing some pretty spicy tunes. Fairly straightforward, but in a pretty good sense, as the songwriting here is all an extremely good example of how to do the genre right, with some great varied riffing, spooky atmosphere, amazing and intricate leads that play off some great melodies to make some really catchy songs. Overall, everything here is done very well. Super fun listen if you're a fan of the genre. For number 52, we have an album that I actually made a full-length review on, and that would be Till Death Do Us Part by Mortanius. This release is some top-tier progressive power metal with a fairly interesting take on the genre, some neoclassical and J-power influence throughout, and overall some pretty stellar songwriting and performances. Definitely recommend taking a look at it, and if you want to hear more about the album, then go ahead and check out that review, since it should help give a bit more insight, so long as you ignore the horrible opening pun. Next up we have Ravenous with Eat the Fallen for number 51, another power metal release and a fairly straightforward and bombastic one at that, quite stylistically similar to Sabaton if Sabaton were a lot better. Very catchy riffs and melodies, great uplifting and intense songwriting, some nice effectual symphonic usage here and there, and some pretty cool, more mid-rangey vocals that feel quite driving. Highly recommended listen since the songwriting throughout this thing is consistently great, and there are tons of very catchy and enjoyable tracks on this album. And after that, we surprisingly have more power metal with Octaviagrace's Radiant, and we are also halfway through the list at number 50 now. So this releases some progressive J-power with some pretty cool and varied influence ranging from jazz to electronic, with lots of present synth and keyboard usage at that. On top of all that, the riffs and melodies on this thing are criminally catchy, and the beautiful vocals simply drive that catchiness forwards way more. The songwriting on this release is absolutely fantastic, and overall this is such an overwhelmingly enjoyable listen, very highly recommended album. Next at number 49 we have Vorvados by Siu, the guitarist of Galnerius, which should give you a pretty good idea on the sound of the album if you know who they are. And as far as I am concerned, Siu is one of the best guitarists out there right now with some absurdly talented compositional skill and playing. This dude's technique is fantastic, and he can shred through some absurdly complex neoclassical lines and solos practically non-stop. On top of that, he's got some great riffs and has a bit of varied influence to the composition on here, which evidently takes some neoclassical and symphonic influence, but also takes a bit from Melodeath. And furthermore, this album has a ton of varied guest vocalists from all over the Japanese metal scene. It is overall a fantastic J-power album and a great listening experience. For number 48, we have Insomnium with Heart Like a Grave, a very well-known progressive melodic death metal band with a very signature sound, one that carries through to this album quite well. The band have their same lower tempo, emotive, melodeath feel, one that evokes quite a bit of atmosphere, and the songwriting on here is as strong as one would expect, taking the sound into both doom and power metal territories at times. The mix of breathtaking, emotional atmosphere and stunningly beautiful and catchy melodies on here makes for a wonderful experience, to say nothing of the intensity that some of the riffs can bring forth at times. Overall, while certainly not their best release, this album is another great success in Insomnium's discography and an absolute blast to listen to. At number 47, we have a fairly interesting release, that being 3 from Bask. This album is a blend of progressive rock, post-metal, psych rock, doom metal, and even bits of country in there. There is a ton of different influence put into this thing, and it all fits very well together into a fantastic and coherent sound, one that is fairly unique, all things considered. The riffs on this thing are extremely catchy, heavy, and fairly groovy, while the melodies follow suit to a degree, being very memorable and generally really fun. On top of that, the vocals on here are pretty great, adding to the overall atmosphere of this thing, which, whilst is not an overwhelming focus, is pretty much always present, and always helping to bind everything together. At that, it's a surprisingly relaxing album, at least compared to most of the other stuff on here, and it puts forth some pretty great emotion. Very high quality release for sure, and very highly recommended. For number 46, we have Allegaeon with Apoptosis, a technical, progressive, and fairly melodic death metal album here, and as you would hope from something with that many spicy prefixes, this thing is a pretty good time overall. Great catchy songwriting with lots of interesting progression and intricate playing, lots of spicy shredding throughout with some pretty inspiring melodies, lots of solid intensity felt throughout this thing, some rather beautiful, more calm moments, and some very nice riffing. Pretty much most of what you want from an album of the sort, somewhat straightforward, but a very enjoyable time at that. At number 45, we have a much shorter self-titled EP by Tryptamyne, and this thing is a very interesting time indeed. blending components of grindcore, technical death metal, jazz, prog, and psych rock. This EP is very avant-garde to say the least. On top of that, this thing has multiple vocalists and even more vocal styles on top of that, leading to a lot more variation in sound than you would usually expect on that department alone, though that goes for pretty much the entire album and every facet of the songwriting, as this thing will practically swap and blend genre influences at the drop of a hat, with generally a very chaotic back and forth of riffs, wild melodies, occasional dissonance, all of that crazy stuff, and the performances on here are all pretty damn great on top of everything. Overall, it is a very crazy listen, and I can definitely imagine that it would turn a few people off with how weird it is, but I absolutely love this release. After that, we get something a lot more straightforward, as for number 44 we have Gloryhammer with Legends from Beyond the Galactic Terrorvortex. Starting off more in the meme territory of power metal, these guys stylistically tend to take after Rhapsody in their similar brand of bombastic symphonic power metal, though on this release there is a noticeable Balsagoth tinge to that influence, making things a bit more intense than you would at first suspect. And despite being very self-aware and cheesy with their themes and lyricism, the band definitely takes the songwriting aspects to this project quite seriously, as the compositions on here are fantastic and a pretty big improvement on their past releases. Tons of great, uplifting, catchy melodies, some surprising use of atmosphere, quality riffs, great implementation of the symphonic portions and the keyboards. It's overall really good. Then, up at number 43, we have Nile with Vile Nilotic Rites, and this is presumably one of Nile's best albums in quite some time. Being a fairly popular, brutal technical death metal band with some cool Egyptian themes and some more Egyptian-esque passages in the music itself, Nile have always stood out a decent bit, and for this album it seems they've decided to ramp the brutality up a decent bit, since this thing is very intense. Tons of heavy, crushing riffs, lots of fast, dizzying, intense melodies, and a very overall foreboding and evil atmosphere shroud this album, making it a consistently very enjoyable listen. And speaking of consistency, the songwriting on this album is very much in line with that. All the songs feel distinguishable and tend to be on the same high level of quality as one another. If you're a fan of crushing riffs and top-tier technicality, then this thing is absolutely a recommended listen for you. For number 42, we have Gomorrah's self-titled album, and this thing is primarily technical death metal with bits of brutal death metal and groove metal mixed in. One of the more noticeable draws is that Hans Grossman, who's worked in Obscura and Alkaloid, does the drumming for this album, and to stellar effect, might I add. Though the rest of the performances are all great on this thing as well. One of the most noticeable features is the riffs on this thing, since they're absolutely stellar. Crushing, heavy, dark, and very intense, and the chaotic lead work on top of it makes things very fun and interesting. On top of that, the ever-present, foreboding atmosphere enhances these traits quite a bit, and everything works really great together, especially considering the production is really good on this thing. Very fun listen, and definitely some of the most memorable riffs of the year on here, I would say. And at number 41, we have Twilight Force with Dawn of the Dragonstar. Twilight Force being a fairly well-known symphonic power metal band, again pretty similar to Rhapsody in their bombastic nature, and with a very uplifting and motivational vibe to them. Interestingly enough, I was not as big a fan of this album at first, but revisiting this thing, it was enthralling. The symphonic portions are written and implemented beautifully on here, and all the riffs are great. The melodies are spectacular, driving, and beautiful, and the vocals are distinct and match the tone of the album wonderfully. There's some spectacular solos on here, some great folk implementations throughout to give the songwriting even more variety. The whole thing is written wonderfully and sounds lovely. Certainly one of the best power metal releases from the year. For number 40, we have even more symphonic power metal with Legends of Human Spirit by Shadowstrike. A pretty new band at that, this being their debut album, and it is a pretty spectacular experience. Being more in the brand of bands such as Angra, Aquaria, and Stratovarius, they do still make heavy use of the symphonic side of things, but generally have a more unique and joyful property to the melodies, and the solos on here are pretty fire. But anyways, in regards to the songwriting, this thing is pretty fantastic. All the symphonic elements are implemented beautifully. There are some pretty quality, catchy riffs on here. The melodies are extremely memorable and super uplifting and fun, and the performances are fantastic, especially the vocals and guitar work, I would say. Certainly one of the best albums if you're looking for some very fun and motivational power metal. At 39, we have Empath by Devin Townsend, one of the most popular and prolific progressive metal artists, and a pretty damn good one at that. So this release is evidently a pretty lengthy one, and on top of that, an extremely varied one in regards to style and compositional elements. There are a lot of stylistic draws from here, all blended pretty damn perfectly into the final product, and all adding unique layers of intrigue and emotion to the album, each song containing something new for the listener on that front. And on the more basic elements of everything, the riffs are pretty damn great, the melodies are spectacular, and more often than not very catchy. All the performances here are great, tons of variety to the vocals, and all of them are lovely. I don't think there is a single thing this album does that is subpar to any degree, including the atmosphere on this thing, which is also quite a high-quality experience. If you're looking for some top-tier progressive metal with some spicy variety and wacky times, then I would definitely recommend checking this out. For number 38, we have Xoth with Interdimensional Invocations, and it is quite a varied experience, to say the least. This album is an overall blend of progressive, technical, blackened, mellow death, and power thrash, and it is quite a time at that. Influence from a huge variety of metal subgenres, all blended together to make what is, in essence, a very unique and varied, extreme thrash metal album. Since at the core of everything, the thrash riffs tend to drive stuff forwards the most on this release. Despite that, though, there is a bit of diversity to the riffs, and the melodies particularly tend to have quite a bit of overall variety, especially with the leads on this thing ranging from black metal-esque tremolos to uplifting power metal-esque leads to very death metal-oriented melodies. It's got a relatively varied atmosphere to it as well, changing depending on the mood of the song, though generally fairly lighthearted stuff, either in the realm of cheesy, evil vibes or genuinely uplifting moments. And the songwriting is overall super consistent and fantastic. There are a ton of extremely memorable moments on pretty much all of the tracks on this album. It's overall quite the great time and a very fun release. At number 37, we have Deep Water Flames by Target, which is another fairly interesting and varied effort. This album is more on the progressive technical side of things, though with some slightly more experimental leanings, with a very present atmosphere and some use of dissonance throughout. In regards to the sound itself, I'd say it's a bit of cross-section between Mirthless and the current Rivers of Nile sound, though again with some decent dissonance here and there. And the end result is something that sounds not quite like anything else out there and leaves not only a unique listening experience with a distinct impression, but a very good impression at that, especially when you take into account the songwriting on here is fantastic. The dark oceanic atmosphere on this thing is melded perfectly with the heavy, crushing riffs and the tumultuous, dissonant melodies, though it can also blend into a calmer state with some of the more serene moments on here, said moments tending to revolve around much more beautiful melodies. The performances on here are pretty great. There are tons of super catchy riffs and lead lines. The solos are rare, but when they hit, they are fantastic. Overall, this album is spectacular. And on top of that, I have not talked to a single person who has heard of it, so as far as I know, this thing is also spectacularly underrated. Would highly recommend looking into it. Up next, at number 36, we have Disillusion with The Liberation. Disillusion are somewhat of a cult classic in regards to progressive melodeath bands, with their debut album being one of the most critically renowned and beloved of the genre, and it is a fantastic release at that, so I don't have much room to disagree, though they essentially fell into inactivity after releasing their sophomore album, which was pretty mixed in reception. However, over a decade later, this here comes out of nowhere, and it is probably the best continuation that could have been asked for, or at least quite near to that. This album has an absolutely stunning use of melody, with essentially each one being incredibly emotive and more often than not very catchy. The progression on this thing is also amazing, the songs flowing between different moods and atmospheres with ease, and doing so with such grace that the massive runtimes for some of these songs can practically feel like nothing. There's quite a variety to the emotion on this album, ranging from serene moments to extremely intense moments and quite a few in-betweens. The vocals are fantastic, managing to be very aggressive without the use of an overly harsh tone, and managing some beautiful melodies when needed with an interesting and gripping tone for both. Overall, this thing has some incredibly memorable moments, incredibly memorable tracks, very emotive songwriting, definitely something that you should check out if you're a fan of progressive metal. For 35, we have Abyssal with A Beacon in the Husk, and these guys are another somewhat well-known band, albeit a bit more underground. Sonically, they blend elements of black metal, death metal, and doom metal all into one big, spooky, dissonant mess, and this album continues that trend. Though all things considered, I would say this release has a bit more of a progressive leaning to it than their previous albums, considering the variety in the compositions when taking account all of the different movements that each song has on here. In any case, this album has a lot going for it. It is certainly an album that is difficult to take songs out of context from, considering how interwoven a lot of the composition is on this thing, and it generally helps with the atmosphere on here being as consistent as it is. The atmosphere tends to be very dark, brooding, and very present. The entire thing is essentially swathed in it, and to great effect at that, as it manages to cloak the dissonance and crushing riffs that this album already brings forth to give them an even more chaotic, reverberant, and unsettling feel. In regards to the riffs, they are very heavy on this thing, and despite how crushing and relatively dissonant they can be, they can also be surprisingly memorable at that, which is pretty damn cool. And again, it all blends together extremely well. Really fantastic album here. For number 34, we get a much more straightforward release, yet still pretty interesting and highly entertaining one, with Blood Incantations, Hidden History of the Human Race. This album has a fairly OSDM feel to it, being some very riff-driven death metal with a fairly thick feel to the production, and a definite resemblance to bands like Demilich and Morbid Angel, though on this release they definitely take a bit more of a progressive and technical approach to their sound. This release has a more varied take to it than the band's past material, with a couple acoustic and folky passages reminiscent of Nile, and some technicality not that far off from Gorguts, for instance. There's still decent use of interesting, dissonant melodies, though there are a lot more straightforwardly melodic ones as well, which juxtapose the rest of the sound surprisingly nicely, and can even get a little hypnotic at times. In regards to the riffs, they have some similarities to a lot of the lead melodies on here, but they do tend to be more in the OSDM and dissonant vein of things overall, being quite heavy and a little on the more chaotic side occasionally. The songwriting overall is fantastic, with some great progression, tons of moments that will quite easily grab your interest, as well as a decent amount of compositional variety on top of things. Overall, a really good release, and though I might consider it a bit overhyped considering how many people are obsessing over it, but it is extremely enjoyable and a very well-crafted release. Next at number 33, we get Million Scarlets by Fuki. Best known for being the vocalist of Unlucky Morpheus and Lightbringer, though she's been involved in a decent few other projects at that. This album here is a solo album of hers and is a blend of J-pop and J-power, so it's probably one of the lighter albums on the list, but this thing still manages to pull out some pretty high-quality riffs on the more metal-focused tracks here. Though naturally, this album is quite focused on the more melodic side of things, with some decent variety to the emotive quality of said melodies, though generally sticking to the more uplifting and motivational feel that you'd expect from power metal. And from J-pop, come to think of it. In any case, the melodies on here are crazy catchy, and there are a ton of more beautiful and inspiring moments on this album as well. The occasional use of electronic elements, piano, and violin all bump things up even further as far as diversity and enjoyability go, and I think it would be extremely difficult for any fan of J-power to find anything wrong with this album. Very fun release from one of the best vocalists in the power metal scene. For number 32, we have Emergence by Dreadnought, which is more or less a post-metal album, though with a lot of varied influence blended into this thing, ranging between prog, doom, jazz, and even slight leanings of folk and black metal. This thing has a pretty diverse sound for sure. The main draw of this album is definitely the atmosphere here, as it is certainly an ever-present aspect of the music and a really compelling aspect of it as well. Much like the Abyssal album, this makes it a lot harder to listen to the songs on here individually, but when taking the whole album together, it shines through really well with a very consuming swathe of emotion that's pretty easy to get lost in. Accentuating the lovely atmosphere on this are the dense riffs and the melodies, the latter of which have some pretty nice variety to them as well, but generally the most standout melodies are those that focus on retaining a sense of beauty and serenity, coupling with the atmosphere for a very, very enjoyable experience. Overall, this album is a very involved listen, and one that is incredibly enjoyable on top of that, certainly something to look into if you're big on post-metal. Then at number 31 on the list is Inferi with The End of an Era Rebirth. So starting off, I will mention that this album is a re-recording of their second album by the same title, sans the Rebirth, and considering it's been a decade since the initial release, as well as the fact that the band is now significantly more popular, it's pretty easy to see the difference between the production and performances on the two releases, with this re-record being comparatively quite the quality revamp. Being a technical melodic death metal band, the boost that these songs get from being well produced is pretty immense, since the melodies shine through a lot more clearly and the technical talent on display is a lot easier to appreciate. I won't say as much on the songwriting, since all of that was done over 10 years ago, but the songs are pretty spectacular on that front as well, having tons of great riffs, catchy melodies, great progressions. It's pretty instrumentally focused, but despite that, the vocals are pretty high quality as well, which is cool. I will say the one thing with the newer production is that I feel that a bit of the impact gets lost as some of the heavier riffing on this thing becomes a bit less intense, but outside of that, all of the leads, the more technical riffing and melodies, and everything else more or less benefits from the revamp to the production by a decent amount, especially when comparing the guitar tone for the more drawn-out melody lines, which is a lot better on this album, I will say. In any case, certainly a good re-recording and a very good bass album on top of that. Definitely recommend looking into this. And once again, that's all for this video. If you have any thoughts on my decisions here, leave a comment below. If you want to check out any of these albums, I will have links in the description. And if you enjoyed your time, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, not only for similar content centered around high-quality metal music, but for more of this list right here, which I will be continuing very soon. Feel free to follow my social media as well. I'm not extremely active there, but I do post more updates and whatnot than I would on YouTube, and if you want to contact me outside of YouTube, then those are pretty easy solutions to that. I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for your time.